Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for coming today on this cold, cold morning in Albany. My name is Jim Malatris. It's nice to see many of you here. We have a great presentation today from one of the leading experts on energy, not just in thought, but in practice, Alicia Barton, who is the president and CEO of NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy and Research and Development Authority. Before Ms. Barton came to New York, she was from Massachusetts. We don't use that against her, especially probably her sports leanings, but we'll let that pass. Before coming to New York, and I've had the honor of working with Alicia for a couple of years, and I've seen her in action. She's really phenomenal. She was the CEO of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center and Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Planning for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Conservation. And she's also done considerable private sector work, actually getting a lot of clean energy projects done. So there's no better person to speak about the governor's vision and the executive's vision for their version of the Green New Deal and how to combat climate change. We're glad that she's able to join us today because, as you all know, the Green New Deal has been out there. People have different versions of the Green New Deal. There's federal versions, state versions. I think every one of you probably have your own version of the Green New Deal. So it would be good to hear the governor's version from Alicia. What's important here is that it's going to be left often to the states. We've been talking about this, whether it's healthcare, education. Given the abdication of many of the responsibilities of the federal government, states are really jumping into these spaces to achieve and make it happen. What we are specifically, we're going to hear from Alicia today is her overall vision of the Green New Deal, but then some tangible, concrete projects to make it happen, which I think is an important thing, not just for the environment, but also for economic development opportunities and activities. So we'll hear from that, from Alicia on that. A couple of points. We are live streamed on Facebook. We're exciting and modern now. We're on Facebook, so you'll all be recorded, just so you know. We have left note cards on your seats. If you have a question, please write it down. We're afraid of Gavin Donahue getting out of control, so we're going to leave index cards here because we don't know exactly what he's going to do from day to day. So if you would write your question down, and then someone with the Rockefeller lapel will pick up the questions, and we'll do questions and answers afterwards. And please silence your cell phones. Often we have phones go off and it's distracting to the speaker. So I'd like to thank the staff of NYSERDA for helping us, as well as the Rockefeller Institute of Government staff led by Heather Trellis. Give them a big round of applause for pulling this together today. And with that, it's my real honor and privilege to introduce and bring up Alicia Barton, the president and CEO of NYSERDA. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Rockefeller Institute for hosting me this morning and for putting clean energy topics on the top of the public policy agenda and discussion. Jim alluded to the debate at the federal level, state level, and everywhere about the Green New Deal that we've already seen in 2019, which has been really, really exciting for people like me who have been working on these issues for my entire career. It really has been a very different conversation already this year than we've seen in the past, with climate change finally reaching really that top tier of issues that people are talking about and debating. And there's a lot to talk about. This is an incredibly complex topic. It involves a lot of important transitions for our society. And I really just want to commend the Rockefeller Institute, and thank you, Jim, for hosting me and for highlighting discussion around these issues. We have a lot going on in the state of New York right now relating to our clean energy initiatives and implementing the governor's vision for a Green New Deal, which, let me see here, I'm going to pull up my presentation. Again, jumping off from the conversation about 2019, Governor Cuomo started 2019 with an incredibly bold set of proposals as part of his State of the State address and budget proposal. Oh, here we go. That's it. There we go. and he launched what are a nation-leading set of new targets for clean energy for the state of New York. So the top line commitment that the governor announced in January is a commitment to 100% clean electricity by 2040. Which is the most aggressive target for 100% clean electricity in the country. That's 5 years faster than any other state has committed to at this time, as well as a more near-term commitment to 70% renewable energy by 2030. That's a significant step up from the governor's prior target of 50 by 30, which was already ambitious, but a few years into implementing that policy, we have seen tremendous momentum already in our ability to procure low-cost new renewable energy for the state of New York, which has been incredibly exciting and really reinforcing to our ability to accelerate those trajectories towards 70% renewable energy and 100% clean electricity based on what we're seeing in renewable energy markets right now. Over the last year and a half, the governor announced that NYSERDA, under our implementation of the Clean Energy Standard, the Clean Energy Standard being the primary policy by which we implement procurement of renewable energy to meet that 50 by 30 goal. We held 2 solicitations and were pleased to announce that we awarded close to 50 new renewable energy projects, 46 new large-scale wind, solar, and hydroelectric projects towards our 50 by 30 target, and had done so at prices that were a substantial discount to procurements we had seen just a couple years earlier. So already over that 2-year time period, we saw a nearly 25% cost reduction in renewable energy supply. And that mirrors trends that we see nationally as well, but it's, as I said, it's not only good news for New York ratepayers, but it's also reinforcing to our ability to meet some of these more accelerated targets that the governor has included in his Green New Deal proposal. In addition to announcing those headline targets of 100% by 2040 and 70% by 2030, also included a number of other initiatives. And I want to spend the bulk of the presentation today talking about offshore wind. But before I do, just to highlight a couple of other highlights from the governor's proposal, which was a commitment to double the state's target for distributed solar energy. So going from a target of 3,000 megawatts to 6,000 megawatts by 2025. Based on what we've seen is, again, really robust growth in solar markets in the state of New York over the last couple of years. 2018 was the largest year in New York State history for installing new solar energy, and beat by a pretty good margin 2017, which was the largest year before that. And you can see that clear upward trajectory at, again, the same time that costs have fallen by wide margins. In fact, installed solar energy costs in New York State have fallen by over half since NYSERDA launched its New York Sun program. As well as the governor's also set out new targets for deployment of advanced energy storage, battery energy storage, with a goal of deploying 3,000 megawatts of new energy storage projects by the year 2030, which again is the largest such target in the country, and a number of other components as well. So it really is a holistic package of initiatives to advance towards what we see as an ability to move towards a clean energy future for New York State over the next decade and 2 decades, and eventually move to a carbon neutral economy, which was the signal that he included in his budget proposal, introducing the Climate Leadership Act, which is pending before the state legislature now. So these are incredibly important, again, big picture public policy conversations. But what I think is really significant about the approach here in New York under Governor Cuomo is that it's backed up by a real plan of action with real targets to move certain sectors forward that we know are critical to our ability to achieve that vision of a clean energy future. And really nowhere is that more true than in the space of planning for and accelerating our pace of deployment around offshore wind energy. And I'm just really excited for the opportunity to be able to talk to all of you about offshore wind, because it is something that is new to the United States. For those of you that aren't aware, there's only 30 megawatts of installed offshore wind energy operating in the United States today. There's one pilot project essentially off the coast of Rhode Island called the Block Island Wind Farm, and that is an incredibly exciting step forward and an incredibly impactful project. But it really is the case that sitting here today, offshore wind does not exist at scale in the United States, yet we see enormous potential for this resource to be one of the single biggest drivers of our ability to decarbonize the electricity system. So again, as part and parcel of the overall Green New Deal proposal that the governor made, he included a target for 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy by the year 2035. And that is far and away the largest commitment to offshore wind energy by any state in the country. That 9,000 megawatts, depending on what scenario you assume in terms of how what level we'll be at for state load, could represent up to 30% of the state's electricity supply in 2035. So that is again a clear statement that we believe offshore wind will be a substantial driver of our ability to decarbonize the electricity sector. And it's one of these exciting conversations because it represents our not only a key tool in our toolbox for decarbonization, but it comes along with it an enormous economic development opportunity. And that's why talking about offshore wind is so exciting. And in general, clean energy jobs is a topic that that I'm very passionate about and really would like to see more recognition of the fact that the clean energy sector is one of the fastest growing sectors nationally, as well as in the New York State economy. There are over 150,000 people employed in the clean energy sector in New York State today. It's a sector that's growing at twice the rate of the overall economy. But when we think forward about what it will take to reach 70% renewable energy by 2030, 100% clean electricity by 2040, as well as, in particular, this new commitment to large-scale offshore wind, those numbers where we sit today are really the tip of the iceberg. And this offshore wind opportunity really does represent a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create an entirely new industry that does not exist today in the United States, that can both build the clean energy system of tomorrow and also create a new heavy industrial and marine industry that we believe will be have its hub here in New York State. And I'll get into some of the details of what we're seeing in the offshore wind market. So. Our first effort to procure offshore wind on behalf of the state of New York is underway today. We, last year in November, issued the first RFP for new offshore wind energy. We sought approximately 800 megawatts of new proposals for offshore wind energy, and we were very pleased to announce a few weeks ago that we received an historic response to that solicitation, with 4 bidders for that first set of contracts to deliver offshore wind to the New York market. And you can see them represented on the slide here. So it's. I want to come back to the details about some of the proposals, but I do want to point out that those 4 proposals represent the most competitive offshore wind solicitation to date in U.S. history, and that the bidders represented, and I'll sort of run through them on the slide, are some of the largest offshore wind and oil and gas majors in the world. So this is an extremely real market opportunity that is attracting competitive interest from very substantial global players. So starting with the slice that is closest to the New York coastline. That project is called Empire Wind, and it is being developed by a company called Equinor, which formerly was known as Statoil. So this is a Norwegian oil and gas company that has invested substantial amounts in building their offshore wind energy business and was awarded a lease off the coast of New York a few years ago, and is developing that project to serve both the New York and New Jersey markets. To the south of that off the coast of New Jersey is a joint venture between Shell, again, another company you may have heard of, as well as EDF Renewables, which is a major renewable energy developer. And they are a newer entrant to the market. They bought that lease from another company that had held it for a number of years. But Shell's entry into the U.S. offshore wind market is a substantial development, to say the least, given their experience. And people probably aren't aware, they have developed offshore wind in Europe previously. This is not their first foray into renewable energy. But it does substantially ratchet up the competitive interest in the U.S. market, which is very exciting. If you look north, the leases are located, you can't quite see the state coastline above it the way the slide is cut, but those are leases located off the coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And Sunrise Wind is really a joint venture, but it's led by a company called Ørsted, who is the largest offshore wind developer in the world. They've developed more offshore wind than any other company has globally. And then the last parcel you see there, Liberty Wind, which is being developed by a company called Vineyard Wind, which is a joint venture between Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which again is a very experienced offshore wind developer, as well as Avangrid Renewables, which is a major utility and renewable energy developer. They are also in the process of developing the largest offshore wind project in the U.S. right now. That's a project that's 800 megawatts that has been awarded a contract to Vineyard Wind by the state of Massachusetts. So what you see here in this lineup is an extremely experienced and, I suppose fair to say, deep-pocketed set of developers who are making substantial investments in the U.S. market. In particular, there were lease sales held off the coast of Massachusetts. I guess it was in December, so a couple months ago. And those lease auctions drew record competitive interest. In fact, those leases went for a combined total, there were 3 of them, went for a combined total of $435 million. It was a really remarkable response to the lease of new offshore wind assets for the U.S. And part of our goal here in New York is to develop more leases towards the southern part of that map, which we will need ultimately to meet the demand of 9,000 megawatts. Although starting today, we are looking at, again, what I think is important for people to realize is a regional market. I think that's a common misconception about our offshore wind development efforts. They will not all be located necessarily directly off the coast of Long Island, although there certainly is one lease area there now, and we would look to see future lease areas developed really in this area here is where the state of New York has been zeroing in on as the most promising location. New York is not the only state investing in this resource. We are also seeing exciting procurements in other states, so Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, notably. Not shown here because it hasn't been awarded yet. New Jersey is also considering a solicitation for offshore wind. So again, there is robust demand increasing rapidly at this point up and down the East Coast. And what you see is a regional national market coming together at a size and scale that really we didn't foresee even just a few years ago. So it's been an incredibly fast pace of advancement and development in contracting for, soliciting for, and developing the U.S. offshore wind market. So our efforts, as I alluded to earlier, around offshore wind are not only focused on getting an extremely new large source of clean electricity, but also we have an holistic focus, I would say, on building an offshore wind industry for the U.S. because, again, we're starting from a place where the industry is deployed at scale in Europe, but is not represented in the U.S. right now, as those projects I just showed on the prior slide they're under development but not constructed, as I said at the beginning. So we're focused on everything from workforce development to port infrastructure, as well as what it will take from a transmission perspective to ultimately integrate 9,000 megawatts of new offshore wind into the New York State electric grid. So the governor's State of the State proposal around offshore wind touched on all of these components and was, again, very broad-based, building on what have been a number of years of study and effort by the state of New York to assess the offshore wind opportunity. So, in fact, just a little over a year ago, NYSERDA, along with many other partners in state government, there were a number of agencies that participated, issued the New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan, which included over 20 studies supporting all types of issues related to offshore wind. So this is something that we have been working on for quite a substantial number of years, including looking at environmental impacts in the marine environment, and again, transitioning towards the opportunity to harness this moment in time to build a new industry here in New York State. So building on that prior work, the governor made new commitments, and I want to I'm happy to talk about any of them in Q&A, but I do want to focus particularly on the port infrastructure piece, which is an incredibly exciting opportunity for our state to attract the global industry to the state of New York, and that's why Governor Cuomo included a commitment for up to $200 million in port infrastructure investment, which is the largest commitment by any state in the country. And as part of the Offshore Wind Master Plan, we had looked at ports all over the state of New York. And again, I think this is another common misconception, which is the idea that the industry would necessarily be solely located on Long Island or potentially Long Island in New York City, when in fact we found that there were ports suitable for hosting various components of the offshore wind supply chain, not only on Long Island, not only in the New York City area, but all the way up the Hudson River, and including here in the capital region as well, which is, I think, really important for people to understand that this is an opportunity that can benefit many regions of New York State, not just the downstate area. It is, I'll fast forward, since we're in Albany today, to, in particular, the fact that NYSERDA, again, along with other partners in the state, like the Port Authority, Empire State Development, have been really taking a deep dive in looking at the capabilities of particular individual port facilities and what it would take to upgrade those facilities to the degree that they would be ideally situated to not only support offshore wind deployment, but really to attract global investment from the types of players I mentioned before in upgrading those assets and building long-term operations at those facilities. And late last year, we issued reports on a number of facilities, including two that are not too far away here, the Port of Albany and Port of Coymans, who really have already jumped to the forefront, as we hear from global offshore wind developers, OEMs, and other supply chain partners, as very attractive locations, not only to support the build out of offshore wind for the New York market, but also that broader regional market that I showed on the map earlier. And in fact, we've had interest from companies that do things like, for example, fabricate foundations for the offshore wind turbines to sit on the seafloor, who have said that they could envision, deploying those foundations out of one of these capital region ports for the support of construction, again, everywhere from New Jersey all the way up to Massachusetts. So it is an extremely large economic opportunity that the state is facing as a whole, and again, that is not really isolated to the downstate area. The leadership by the governor and the state of New York to attract the industry here is substantial, and I can say that since the time the governor announced the 9,000 megawatt target, as well as the commitment of up to $200 million in new investments in port facilities, which would represent the largest investment by any state to date, have attracted substantial interest from the industry. And of course, we were already engaged with many of those partners over the last number number of years, as I alluded to, given that this has been, a multi-year effort by the state to plan for the offshore wind opportunity. But this recent set of announcements really was eye-opening. And shown on this slide is a port in Denmark that I have had the opportunity to visit, and it paints a picture of what the future could look like for facilities here in New York if we are successful in our efforts to attract the industry here, and I think we will be for a number of reasons. One is again, the size of the New York market is unique nationally, so the other states that are investing in deploying offshore wind are also eagerly trying to attract investment, and that's a good thing. I think the more coordinated and also aggressive states are, either individually or collectively, the more successful we'll be at attracting the European supply chain to come to the U.S. even faster. But New York, as I said, is sort of, I think, at the front of that list, given our 9,000 megawatt commitment. It's a signal to developers that they are planning for the long-term build-out of offshore wind in the U.S., that New York is the market to be in. We will be the largest market. And also, we have, a longstanding track record of a highly skilled workforce that has delivered large and complex infrastructure projects. That's what New Yorkers do and do really well, is build extremely large and complex and global leading infrastructure projects, and including, for example, the participation of the ports here in the capital region in the construction of the new Mario M. Cuomo Bridge that was completed last year. That's an example of that type of global leading infrastructure construction that New York knows how to deliver, and that again represents a broad-based effort across the state. One last topic I want to highlight in terms of our overall approach to offshore wind before open it up to questions is the fact that I'm very proud that last year New York was awarded by DOE an approximately $20 million grant to administer a national R&D consortium for offshore wind. This was a national competition, and NYSERDA, along with several other partners, applied and was ultimately awarded this grant from DOE to start up an R&D consortium, which really will have a laser-like focus on advancing the state of R&D in the offshore wind sector to reduce levelized cost of energy, which we know, again, will have significant benefits to New York ratepayers as we look to scale offshore wind in our overall energy portfolio. So these are earlier stage efforts. They're focused on advancing technology, advancing the supply chain, advancing techniques for in-water construction, and really a range of different efforts that have been detailed in the R&D roadmap that was already published a few short months after we launched the consortium. And one of the things that I'm really excited about the consortium is not only that it's a partnership between DOE and NYSERDA, it's also a partnership with leading members of the industry. We have 11 global leading offshore wind developers participating in the consortium already, as well as 3 additional states, so that it's not only a multi-state effort in terms of our working with DOE, but now Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia have also formally joined the consortium and committed substantial dollars to that effort as well. So it's really a unique opportunity, again, to anchor the intellectual property and the early stage development of the U.S. offshore wind market in New York as part of this very unique, I can't really think of a lot of other efforts just like it, public-private, state and federal partnership that we've put together under the consortium. So this is something that NYSERDA has been leading, that we're very proud of and hope will deliver substantial benefits towards this long-term offshore wind development effort as well. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. I'm really eager to hear thoughts, perspective, and questions about what we're working on in terms of building New York into the signature market for offshore wind in the U.S.
Let's give Alicia a really big round of applause. I have golden tickets, Alicia, questions for you. We'll start We'll start with the hard ones that just get harder, it seems. We have a very involved crowd.
Good.
Thank you very much for the offshore wind as a component piece. There's a question from the audience about onshore wind as a component of the Green New Deal. They said we'll need more than 10 gigawatts of onshore wind. Where's it going, and what's NYSERDA doing about it to build local support for places like Wayne County, where there's been no development to date? I guess the specific question is onshore wind, but a broader question could be, in theory, this always sounds good, offshore wind, onshore wind, projects like this, but NIMBYism and other local issues often pop up. So how do you deal with those local issues more broadly, and then specifically to onshore wind? Maybe you can answer.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I'm very happy to talk about that. Onshore wind does represent a substantial component of what we believe will be needed to meet those renewable energy targets that I talked about earlier. And we already have a large number of land-based wind projects under development in the state today. Actually, there's through the recent NYSERDA solicitations, as well as ones that preceded that a number of years ago, there's actually a fair amount of wind development going on in the state, which has created a number of important conversations at the local level about what it means to host wind energy facilities. This is something that I think you're just right, Jim, is easy in theory and difficult in reality when it shows up as a real proposal in someone's backyard, so to speak. And we have been working very hard at the state to try and facilitate good decision making around development of wind projects. And I always want to start by saying not every project is the best project or is the right project, and we understand as a state that the long-term path to success is supporting and empowering local communities to choose the projects that are right for them, to empower them to be equally footed as much as possible in negotiations with developers, to have the right information to make informed choices. And that's really been the strategy that we've taken as to how to deal with this issue, which is coming up in a number of regions across the state. So NYSERDA has recently, we have staffed up our team that are solely devoted to traveling around the state of New York and speaking with communities at the local level about fact and fiction on wind energy. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, talking to them about things like setbacks and how to structure their zoning bylaws, how to calculate property tax benefits for the state and or negotiate a pilot agreement or other type of community host benefit agreement. And, I do think those efforts have been largely positively received by local communities, but we do still have a long way to go, for sure. It's always, I think it's, we know this, it's difficult to build any type of large infrastructure project, whether it be, a wind turbine or a new, strip mall development or the like. People are rightly concerned about what these developments mean for the character of their community. So our strategy has been to focus on, again, giving the communities that hands-on information and hopefully empowering them to have good conversations at the community level where they can say yes to projects that are good and that will deliver real benefits for their community. And we are seeing a number of communities that are saying yes and that are saying this is going to be good for, for our community and for our tax base. There are, a longer set of conversations around, the permitting of those projects by the state through the Article 10 process, which, is the primary kind of process for approving those projects at the state level. And again, just to make clear, saying at the beginning, again, we know that not every wind project will be, the right project, and we do hold developers to a high standard. We also feel strongly that, the community voices do need to be well represented in those state approval processes, and both NYSERDA and the Department of Public Service, who administer that process, are very focused on that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stick with the offshore wind a little bit. First, I really appreciate the person's penmanship. It's very readable, this question, so I appreciate that very much so. Do you anticipate energy storage coupled with offshore wind and upcoming offshore wind solicitations?
That's a great question. We do allow for that, and I should have said, maybe I went briefly through what we've done on the land-based side over the last 2 sets of procurements under the Clean Energy Standard. As I said, we awarded 46 new utility-scale renewable energy projects. 5 of those were paired with energy storage, and that's something that our solicitation does allow for developers to include in their bid if they think that it would, provide benefits to the project, and in our assessment, when we look at the price and other components of the project, it provides benefits. So I think that that's definitely a foreseeable outcome under our solicitations. On the other hand, we don't have a bias towards necessarily pairing the 2 things together directly. As I mentioned, we have an extremely aggressive set of plans and incentives for deployment of energy storage in the state of New York. And we could see, for example, that storage being deployed to places on the system that are not necessarily paired with the operation of offshore wind, but still in their individual way contribute to both cleaning and making the electricity system more flexible and more reliable over time. So we're sort of taking an all of the above approach to allowing them to come forward together or individually.
Great. Here's one very nice penmanship as well. How does offshore wind turbines affect marine ecosystems in those areas that you mentioned? And has NYSERDA investigated the long-term effects of offshore wind that they can have on marine life generally?
Yes, the answer is we have been spending a lot of time investigating that, as has the industry as a whole, and it's an important issue. We do take very seriously, again, the impacts of any project that gets proposed, but particularly we understand this is a new frontier for energy project development in a marine environment, again, which has not happened in the U.S. previously. And there are a number of concerns that get raised about impacts to certain marine species, like the North Atlantic right whale, for example, or avian species, as well as on fish and the fishing industry as well, both recreational and commercial. These are really important considerations that actually we have placed front and center in our process. They were part of the New York offshore wind master planning process for the last couple of years, and we have done actual in-water studies on the areas off the coast of New York that we believe will be developed, and that we are asking the federal government to develop new lease areas to make sure we understand those impacts. But we've also put those considerations directly into our energy solicitation that NYSERDA has issued for these contracts, and we are the first state to include specific requirements for fisheries mitigation as well as environmental mitigation to be submitted along with bids for the energy contract, which we think is an important piece of the puzzle in evaluating whether these projects will be good projects that have on net substantial benefits for the state of New York. We are also committed to long-term study of these issues and have included specific solicitations recently to advance, again, the science around these issues, as well as through the R&D consortium that I mentioned. So we are doing quite a lot on that front, and I do think it's an important issue for the public and stakeholders to understand that those considerations are being reviewed carefully.
Great, thank you. This gets into the how do you incentivize the process, and this is a question about using the private sector versus the public sector. There are private developers competing to provide transmission for offshore wind in New York State. So why is NYPA, the New York Power Authority, which is the public electricity, bidding as well?
So the bids that I showed on the slide do represent various consortium of bidders for the opportunity. And I want to be clear in the transmission context. There's 2 things that get kind of brought up. One is the transmission associated with those projects, and maybe to just flip back to the slide so people can see the map. There will be turbines proposed in those lease areas. The dark blue with the hash are the ones that are bidding on the current contract, and they will develop transmission, sometimes with partners. So NYPA, which does develop commercial projects, is partnered on one of the proposals. the Sunrise Wind project, along with a couple of other utilities as well, Eversource and Con Ed, who are participating in that particular partnership that is bidding. But those are for a specific project. So you'll see, the offshore wind developer with, a transmission provider come together to deliver, a way to connect those turbines to shore. You also saw, for example, on Liberty Wind, a partnership with a different transmission developer, Ambaric, who also partnered with the offshore wind developer to deliver that transmission solution. So we have allowed that in our solicitation, and we think that those type of partnerships will make the projects stronger. What we talk about more broadly with transmission, and was part of the governor's State of the State proposal, is really thinking forward about planning for the long-term build-out of offshore wind transmission, not associated necessarily with an individual project, but really thinking about how do you, for example, build collector stations for multiple projects to feed into, and/or there has been discussion historically about, transmission backbones that would run, and connect lease areas up and down the East Coast. Those conversations are important, and I do think that for the long-term success of the offshore wind market, we have to be thinking differently about the way we deliver offshore wind transmission and moving away from the one project, one transmission line model. But there's a lot to figure out there, and that's not something that, there aren't that many models in the U.S. for where that's been done in similar contexts. So I think there's a lot ahead of us in terms of policy discussion with utilities, with the Public Service Commission, with NYSO and others to figure out what that model could look like for the long term.
Great, thank you. This, shifting gears a little bit to the meeting the workforce needs if you're developing offshore wind, what industry signals should workforce development entities look for to prepare for the needs of offshore wind construction and operations?
So that's a great question, because for a long time we've been talking about offshore wind and developing, this workforce, and the question is, when will it come? When will we be ready for that? And I do think I have been not sure of that answer for some time, but now that we are seeing the types of proposals come forward that we have, I actually think the time for that is very near. We are going to see a number of projects go through the development process and towards construction in the next few years ahead of us, and we do need to start now to develop a skilled workforce that can actually deliver those projects and make sure that, again, that as much as possible those projects are built with, for our purposes, New York State labor, but more broadly U.S. labor, as opposed to potentially needing to outsource skills that don't exist in the U.S. today. So we have signaled a pretty sizable investment in offshore wind workforce training and development, and we are actively considering, the ways to support that. We actually have workforce funding opportunities that NYSERDA makes available for a range of technologies today that are also eligible for offshore wind, and we are working very closely with partners in the labor community, in community colleges and other training providers to understand, how to actually put in place some of those programs on the right schedule. It is something that is just around the corner at this point in time, I really think, and we are actively working on that.
Great, thank you. This gets into your discussion a little bit of the infrastructure, the port infrastructure. How do you envision allocating the $200 million in port infrastructure support, and when, given the ambitious timetables you describe?
So that is something that we are continuing to develop plans for, and really trying to, keep a strong focus on something that has been a hallmark of both our energy procurement process, but also, the state's approach to economic development, which is we want to see a signal for private sector participation in these investments as well. So part of our strategy and the governor's goal in sending out those high-level market signals of 9,000 megawatts and up to $200 million in port investment is to start that conversation about what those investments will actually look like. And we are, as I said, fielding a number of inquiries from global players around that who really, I think, found those commitments to be extremely significant and are now investing their time and energy in developing projects in the state. But we are, I think, another a couple steps away from seeing those projects actually come together, because we are doing our homework at this point in time. And again, with other partners, ESD, the Port Authority, Department of Transportation, other partners in state government, to make sure that we can take a thoughtful approach and assess what the best strategies will be for providing different incentives, whether it be tax incentives or financing or, economic development grant incentives like the kind ESD administers. We are looking hard at all of those options, and I think we'll have more to say about that after we take a couple more steps to understand what the private sector brings forward for proposals.
Great, thanks. This gets to the capacity issue of developing renewable energy. Is New York planning to build excess capacity of renewable energy, I'm presuming, in order to export that energy to inland states, Canada, as Denmark did in their region?
That's a really interesting question. So whenever we talk about these efforts, we do have to remind ourselves and then remind others that we are dealing with regional markets. We talk about, these targets for, a certain amount of megawatts of this type of resource for New York State. And unless, we're talking about smaller scale solar, which is on the distribution system, we are talking about projects that sell into wholesale electricity markets, which again are regional markets. So it's both true that we could build projects to export capacity. It also could be true that projects could be built outside the state to import renewable energy capacity. And again, we're seeing that specifically in the offshore wind context, where those projects, some of them will be, and all of those, I should say, are located in federal waters for reference rather than state waters, but will be entering the New York market in various ways. We have not, I'd say, given the level of ambition that we have for the state's electric grid, we haven't really thought past that to being sort of a net exporter concept. But the way that this develops, again, will necessarily be regional in nature. So there will be ability for both of those eventualities to come forward in terms of how electrons ultimately flow. What is interesting and what I think is more impactful about, the signals that we send is that, so the New York market is a large market. We have, a very, we have over 20 million people. It's a large population. So that in and of itself has a huge impact. But what we do also sends a broader regional signal to other states. And you see that effect very powerfully when New York commits to 100% clean electricity, other states take a look at that and say, we maybe that's possible for us too. When we commit to 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy, they start to think, well, how much can we deliver? And there is this sort of reinforcing mechanism. So I think, whether you are physically building assets and exporting them, it really is, in my mind, without a doubt true that these big picture signals are moving the regional market towards an overall cleaner electricity mix, and that's very powerful and very positive from where I sit.
Great, thank you. These are a series of questions on transmission, which is always a fascinating topic, talking about NIMBY and other issues. I'll give both of the questions to you because they're sort of similar. Are there plans or incentives to improve land-based energy transmission coming from wind energy projects? The point of the question being existing infrastructure is aging and at capacity, and will there be a move to incentivize support for transmission lines? And then the flip side of this is in the offshore wind context, how different will it be to move from a land-based transmission infrastructure to a water/land-based transmission system?
Well, I think it makes sense to take both of those questions together, and we do think about them together, meaning when we've recently, and it hasn't been that long, just been since January, really made public and wrapped our minds around a commitment to 100% clean electricity system. You absolutely do have to think hard about what that means for transmission. This is a key part of the puzzle of how do we actually put together a system that can deliver, the clean energy attributes that we want, but let me make incredibly clear, without compromising reliability or public safety or functionality of the electric grid. And so, I spoke about energy storage, but not to the exclusion of thinking about transmission upgrades that may be needed to support a different distributed energy system than we have today. That being said, we have not issued specific plans for example, as the questioner asked, publicly supporting new transmission projects. That may well be part of the conversation, the public policy conversation that takes place as we move forward on these plans. I'll note that, there are forums at the New York ISO that are looking hard at public policy transmission needs in coordination with the Department of Public Service. There are also there will be discussions around that in the state energy planning process that will, I believe, take place to really adopt the goals that have been put out there and then figure out, from a public policy standpoint, what do you need to do to make those goals reality? So we have a couple of steps ahead of us to think that through. And offshore wind transmission is a very specific example of that, but it's not the only one. In terms of the in-water versus land-based, I do think there are a few technical differences, but I think the bigger difference is, again, the jurisdictional issues, the fact that that the transmission is not all within New York State. It certainly will connect to federal waters, for example, and how you look at permitting of various states and the federal government in that conversation, and not only permitting but funding under things like FERC tariffs are, again, complex issues that we have ahead of us, frankly, to figure out.
Just to play into that question about
Sure.
Federal government transmission lines, especially siting offshore wind. Is there jurisdictional issues that you have to run into as a state entity in siting offshore wind projects, given these are in oceans and part of jurisdictional boundaries? Yes,
there are. And in fact, I mentioned that the farms are located in federal waters, and this is a key part of our work has been trying to work with the federal government. In this case, the agency is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, to lease additional areas for offshore wind development. We don't control that process. We do participate in the process, but ultimately these are leases of the ocean area by the federal government that has its own process associated with it. As I mentioned, I'll just again show on the slide. In the interest of brevity, I didn't go into too much detail here, but it really is this area sort of southeast of New York and straddling New Jersey. It's kind of in and around here that we have targeted as the best place, as we see, that poses the least amount of conflicts for offshore wind development with things like the fishing industry or the shipping industry, or impacts to sensitive marine species, as we talked about before. And that is a process that, frankly, we are eager to move more quickly than it has been moving. That's something that, again, is outside of our control, but something that we have seen fairly good support from the federal government. I know I do get a lot of questions about the impacts of the Trump administration on the state's clean energy efforts, and by and large, a lot of energy markets are really at the state level. So, we do see some headwinds, but not direct impacts in many cases. In this case, this is on the critical path, but I'm pleased to say that so far the Trump administration, for a number of reasons, including the potential to create new manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and otherwise, have been relatively supportive of offshore wind development. And I mentioned the amount of money that the lease sales off the coast of Massachusetts generated a couple months ago in December, and that, of course, is another strong signal for the federal government. They're very eager to see additional lease auctions go forward that can raise fairly substantial amounts of revenue for the federal government, as they have done historically with oil and gas leasing. So for their own reasons, perhaps, they have been fairly supportive, but it's one of those issues that we do have to continually navigate, because it is not something within our own control.
Great. This is the quintessential New Yorker question. Is there any effort to implement a PR strategy for public acceptance of quote-unquote windmills? And the question being, nice but not in my backyard oceanfront.
So we haven't, I would say, haven't embarked on a PR strategy, so to speak, but I do think public education and outreach is on the critical path for our ability to meet our clean energy goals, without a doubt. When it comes to not in my backyard and communities, I mean, I touched on that, and I think it is important that the state not impose a view that these projects, have to get built every place they're proposed, but that we do have strong respect for local control and local input on the evolution of those projects and what will make them successful projects for the long run. So, it's all part of that larger conversation. And I will say that kind of going back to the beginning, public dialogue on this issue has shifted quite a lot in just a couple of years, including at local meetings for citing of individual projects. You do hear more and more citizens speaking out about their desire for a cleaner energy future, their concerns about climate change. They are seeing the effects of climate change firsthand. This is, again, I think a marked shift in awareness, but we do still have a long way to go. And I think, the public conversation will continue about that, whether via sort of state-led public education and outreach or otherwise, given again the amount of attention that this topic is getting nationally. Finally.
Great. The final question that we have here sort of is full circle because it comes back to the overarching Green New Deal that you've talked about, and they have a very specific question I'll ask sort of more broadly off of this. It's not related to wind. The Cricket Valley natural gas facility will be up and running by 2020 and will produce 1,100 megawatts of power. Natural gas is not clean and renewable energy. Will the plant be closed as part of the governor's plan? And more broadly, talk about how you transition in a public sector or electricity sector into renewable energy, and what's the state's plan for that more broadly, I think is the question. Yeah,
it's these are exactly the kinds of questions that we have in front of us to wrestle with from a public policy standpoint, and they're really important. We have, as part of the governor's plan, let me make clear, there has not been a specific prohibition on natural gas infrastructure or individual plants. That's not part of the strategy that he has outlined. But without a doubt, we are talking about transitioning to 100% clean electricity on the electricity supply side, and ultimately a carbon neutral economy, which ideally will represent a portfolio approach where we can allow a number of different strategies, including, technologies like carbon capture and storage and the like, to come forward and help us achieve some of those long-term goals. These are very, there are individual projects that have, quite a lot of support and opposition, and they are part of the conversation each time about how to make that transition. But the approach that we've laid out really is one that does envision a transition over time, not overnight, and does, again, allow for a portfolio approach where we are leaning hard into incentivizing clean technologies. At the same time, that will necessarily represent a reduction in natural gas fired generation on the system. So it's not so black and white as, is yes or no, can you build any particular project at this time, which is, people probably have a range of perspectives on whether that should be the case or not, but we are more in a position of setting out what we think the net performance target should be, eliminating carbon from the electricity system and eventually from the overall economy, and assessing carefully how we take incremental steps and a portfolio approach to achieve those ultimate goals.
Great. Let's give a big round of applause to Alicia Barton.
No, thanks for having me.
It's always difficult to come in early in the morning and ask difficult questions, but answer difficult questions. But this is an important part of the conversation as New York State's moving forward with the Green New Deal. We're going to have other speakers as well speak on the topic from multiple perspectives. So we hope you can join us. Thank you again for coming. Thank you, Alicia, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.